Okay, let's get started on video 6, working with paths and shapes. This is kind of the level 1 basic part 1. So this is just going through the real basics of how you build shapes. So we're going to start paying a little more attention over here to our toolbar. I'm going to get rid of my palettes here for colors because I'm not overly concerned. I just want a nice clean workspace. This is the benefit of having a multiple monitor setup with Illustrator, is you can put all your palettes to one side and just really have a nice clean drawing area, which is how I like to work, but obviously we've got to have palettes on so you can see them in the demos. In case you're not familiar, if you're just really new to Illustrator and you're seeing me do this, it's like, well, what's going on there? A little hand grab. That's just holding down the space bar. You use this really commonly. It's much more fine-tuned than these draggers. These are kind of hard to use. Or using your scroll wheel, that's also kind of hard to use, but just hold down the space bar with your thumb. You just drags your artboard around. And again, if you're not familiar with what an artboard is, let's just bring that up. I'll quickly cover this because I don't think it deserves its own video. Is that, your artboard is the first file. You make your set up a new Illustrator file and you pick your size. This is an 11 by 17 portrait, and my first artboard is there. It's this thing. Now I can give this a name. I can double click on the name and change it to, demonstration 1. And I can double click on this little guy over here, this icon, which is going to bring up the artboard options. Okay, so you can change the width and the height, right? If you want to change it. You can set a couple of display options, like a center mark, kind of nice video ruler pixel aspect ratio 1 if you're doing kind of fancy public or broadcast design stuff. You can change that, but you're not going to for most of your needs. And then you can also change the reference point for the artboard. So this actually is important in terms of how InDesign imports or places an artboard. By default, it's the upper left-hand corner. So that's going to reference the the relative coordinates within your placement box. So X and Y 0, 0, this is at the 0, 0 point of this document. Okay, so let's say I want to have another page in an Adobe Illustrator file. Artboards are effectively pages, so you can have multiple pages in your artboard. This is your artboard tool right there. Allows you to also just interactively resize and scale your artboards. Also, similarly, you can hold down the Alt key or the Command key on Mac and click and drag to duplicate an artboard. You can see that now I've got a duplicate, and anything that's unlocked, any graphics that are on this artboard will automatically duplicate over to your new artboard. So artboards can be kind of a handy way to have different sizes or orientations of the same kind of core graphic all in one file. So that can be really handy if you're doing like digital ads or whatever. But a lot of times if we're doing something like a logo, we kind of want every artboard to be exactly the same because we're going to have multiple color versions of the same logo, and we want them all to be in exactly the same spot on the artboard, so we don't need to keep a separate file for the black version, the full color version, the knockout version. We can put that all in one Adobe Illustrator file on separate artboards, and then we can choose which artboard or page to place into Adobe InDesign. So that's artboards kind of in a nutshell. They're not overly complex, but again, I think unless you notice the artboard palette, you might assume you can only ever do one artboard in Adobe Illustrator, but you can do more than one for sure. Okay, so now we want to kind of get into getting into the fundamentals of working with our shapes, okay? And then we're going to cover a couple of core ideas about how Illustrator just kind of works fundamentally as a drawing tool, and what we want to start doing, or how we want to start thinking about it as a drawing tool. The main thing I think that is a bit of a mind shift in terms of, when you come to drawing in general, is that when we pick up a pencil or maybe we work in Photoshop, we think about things as lines, And I shouldn't have used the pen tool. I should have used the brush tool. Okay, so, we tend to think, oh, okay, I'm going to draw, a little eye here. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I'm not very good at drawing with a mouse. I can draw with a pencil pretty decently, but not a mouse. So I would color things in, this is traditionally how we approach drawing, isn't it? But that's not quite how Adobe Illustrator really is intended to work. It's got a brush tool, but let's think about what we're really doing in Adobe Illustrator. So Adobe Illustrator, let's get our layers palette going here. So look what I did with that pen tool. I created all this kind of mess of a whole bunch of little shapes and all these kind of lines and stuff like this. And all I did was just drew in lines. Unless I'm like, oh, I want to fill that with blue. It's like, oh, well, that's not what I wanted. I want that. How am I going to control this? And you're like, oh shit, I got this shape. And, oh, what's this straight line going on? That's because Adobe Illustrator, a stroke or a line is not really here to make drawings. It is here to actually put a line of color around a shape and provide that trapping in the overprint process, because Illustrator back in its very, very first versions was essentially a tool for silkscreen graphics production to make it much easier for commercial production, because back in the day when we did silkscreening, and I'm actually old enough to remember this, you would cut out your shapes using an X-Acto knife and something called Rubylith, and you'd have to envision each of your colors with one single color of Rubylith, stack up your layers of this sort of transparent vinyl, and you could buy different colors of Rubylith to sort of show the colors, kinda, but it wasn't great. It was pretty hard to visualize. You kind of really needed to understand. So Illustrator came out, and it was just this amazing thing, because now we could visualize graphics like they were cut with an X-Acto knife, but we could change the colors to exactly what we wanted, and we could actually layer our structure. So built right into the DNA of how Adobe Illustrator is designed is really like a digital Rubylith drawing tool, drawing with an X-Acto knife and cutting out shapes. So it is just very much oriented around shapes and not so much about lines. So there's this thing, outline mode, Control Y, okay? So view, it's up here too, preview mode or outline mode. Okay, so preview is preview, and see your colors how it is, and then view outline is outline. So let's just zoom in and see what outline really means, right? So when I tried to fill in using my pen or my Wacom tablet or whatever, I'm drawing a bunch of these lines, and I can work with them, and they're fine, they're paths, but they don't have any fill to them, right? And that's sort of a look, but I would say if you want to get sort of really freehandy type of stuff, there's a time and a place for this type of thing, but that's more Photoshop. Photoshop is more meant to reproduce natural painting and things like that. Illustrator is more about shapes and really working with your shapes and building complex graphics out of shapes, and then, converting everything to finished kind of tidy graphics that we can then apply colors to and use in production environments. So you've got your pen tool, which is drawing a custom shape, and you've got your what are called your primitives, a rectangle, a rounded rectangle, which there's really not much reason to use either or, except if you just want a square. Your ellipse, which is ellipses, circles, ovals, what have you, polygons, multiple sides of polygons, and then stars. And then this kind of goofy thing called a flare tool, which isn't a shape at all. It's more of like a Photoshop hodgepodge, and I just please don't use it. I don't know why they built it in. I guess lens flares were such a thing in the 2000 and something that they just didn't decide to go and build a flare tool. But no, that's not. Please do not. And really, even polygons and stars, they have their place for sure. But you can do kind of some cool things. So let's just put each of these down. I've got a rectangle which I can move around. I can hold down the Shift key, and that's going to draw a perfect square. I can hold down the Alt and the Shift key, and that's going to draw a perfect square from the center out. So that applies to any one of your primitive shapes. Okay, I'm going to do a rounded rectangle tool here, so hold down Shift to make a square. But that shape is redundant now because this is, I forget when they introduced this to Adobe Illustrator, but it's a really nice feature because it allows you to round your corners, and that's what these little things are right here. So before I get into doing too many different shapes, let's just put an ellipse, a circle, and an oval, and a star, and a polygon. Let's just get all those down on on our artboard, because each of them kind of has their own sort of behaviors and stuff like that. So what I'm doing here is, you click and drag, that's going to give you the default. Okay, but if I want to put down, if I just click and I don't drag and I have a square selected, it's going to bring up this dialog that says, well, how big do you want your rectangle? So you can type it in. So say, you want a perfect business card size triangle. That's 3.5 by 2 inches. So there you go. That creates it, and then you can drag it around this way. And note that when I'm working with the shape, I'm using what's called the selection tool. It is different than the direct selection tool. I'll cover that in a bit more detail later here. But mostly for just moving entire shapes around, we're talking about using the selection tool. And when I click on a path, okay, this portion of the shape, or this thing here in the middle, the center angle, that is just moving the thing around. But I've also got these handles here, and you'll notice that the icon changes. If I grab a handle, that's going to resize the shape. So that's not the same as moving a shape. So that's what these corner handles are for. It's for resizing. But if you just want to move the thing around, if I don't click on anything, nothing, right? I fill it with a color. Now, because it's got a fill, now I can just grab anywhere. But if I have no fill, okay, Illustrator says, well, you're not trying to select that shape then, because you can see what's in here, right? So if these are not filled, it doesn't work. But if I fill them both with that same color, now I can click right in the color and move those around. So that's just getting comfortable with what the selection tool does and how it works. Obviously, it listens to the layer structure. So if this is on top, I can't click through it. But if I had no fill, then I could click through and grab whatever's filled underneath there. So that's another little kind of subtle thing that isn't always so obvious about Adobe Illustrator, is that fill changes the way you select and manage your shapes. Okay, so I also talked about what this thing here is about. This is newish, and it kind of makes the rounded rectangle tool a bit redundant, because you can just round the corner of any shape that has corners. So that includes things like polygons. You can round the corners in your polygons too. So each of these primitives, I call them, they each have their own thing. Like if I click and hold here and go to the ellipse tool, or go to the rounded rectangle tool, I won't skip that one, and I just click instead of clicking and dragging, it asks me, well, how big do you want it? But then what's your corner radius? So I can get kind of specific. I can say, well, I want a 1/4 inch corner radius. So that's going to create a business card block that has a 0.25 corner radius, right? Which is not quite as easy as, when I click and drag it, I can get it, but it's, I got to do it manually, so it's not quite as easy. So that's about the only point I can think of for why you would use the rounded rectangle tool to create a primitive. So if you didn't want to futz around with the corners. Ellipse tool, if you just click, it's just going to ask width and height. So a circle obviously has the same, an oval has different. Click and hold again. Polygon tool, click, how many sides, how big do I want it to be? So let's say I want it to be 1 inch, and I want it to be a decahedron, I think, 10 sides. Any of you Dungeons and Dragons fans out there can tell me otherwise. But so you can kind of create, obviously the more sides you add, eventually it's just going to essentially become a circle. But it is going to build this kind of differently depending on from an oval, because it's going to create straight lines. We'll get into anchors and nodes a little bit down the road. I'm just going to move this guy there. And then, of course, last but not least, the star. And let's say I just wanted to make a real big starburst, 20 points, and I want it to be circular. This is like, new and improved from Hasbro graphic. Oh, that didn't do what I wanted it to do. That's because I did the inside. Whoops. I forgot the star. So it's radius 1, radius 2. So if you do it the same, you kind of get basically a polygon. But if you want to do it like this. So we'll make this one 0.75. So then you get the kind of more complex star shape. And again, if you, once you've created a basic shape, you can't really, the only way you can go through and manipulate it is with the selection tools. But you can see here, Illustrator is tracking these shapes as different things. So, this is a path because it treats the star shape as a pre-built path, just a regular shape. But it does recognize rectangles, ellipses, and polygons. We'll talk a little bit about expanding appearance and stuff like that. But that's why, I believe that's why anyways, why I can't use the round cornering tool unless I go to direct selection. In which case I can kind of do some kind of interesting things and make little spirography things like that. But that only works with the direct selection tool as far as I'm aware. Yeah, and you can just round one corner by selecting it. So that kind of leads naturally into anchors. So if you're really new to Illustrator, anchors are points on a path that you can manipulate. And there's actually two types of anchor. There's a straight anchor, okay, so that just goes like this, and then there's a curved anchor that has an additional element called a handle. So you can grab and drag a handle to change the relative relationship. So it's kind of like, it's like drawing with a rubber band, you got this curve here. So this is a curve path, and then this is an anchor path, right? So if I want to make it into two curves, I could just click the little curve tool, and then that expands out into two anchors that now have two independent handles. Sometimes you got to zoom in real close to see them because they're going to be kind of teensy tiny, right? But you can see it's just created that corner path there. So a lot of times this is where you sort of go, well, starting with primitives is a little limiting because of the default anchors that it gives you, and that is what the pen tool is all about. The pen tool is really your do it all, go to it, create the most custom looking stuff tool. It's really the main drawing tool. There's this thing called the curvature tool, and again there's the silly paintbrush tool and the silly line segment tool, although that's got its place. But the curvature tool, maybe you can use it, but I honestly would be impressed with anybody who could really work with it in any true sense of the word, because it only produces curves, whereas a pen tool produces both curves and corner angles. And realistically, when we're drawing out a shape, whatever it might be, the pen tool is the most flexible. So again, the pen tool is just starting with nothing but anchors, and then as you go, you define what type of line or path you want between your two anchors. So anchor 1, anchor 2, let's just, I can hold down shift to constrain to 45 and 90 and 0, but most of the time you're kind of free forming it. And this is also a decent time to talk a little bit about grid snapping and snapping tools and stuff like that. Okay, so in my view, snap to point, most of the time I leave that on, and I also tend to leave Smart Guide on. If you really want just true freedom to put down anchors with no Illustrator not assisting you with anything, you can turn off snap to point and turn off Smart Guides, and you're just totally freeform drawing your shapes. But most of the time we want our shapes and stuff to line up. We want our shapes to kind of fit together. And depending on what type of graphic we're working on, and as we go through the different projects, you're going to definitely see where this fits and where it doesn't. You can also snap to the grid, snap to pixel, and then snap to glyph, which is a relatively new thing for type. Just makes working with type a little easier, so it's kind of a nice thing. But most of the time, snap to point, and it just helps you line up your shapes. But there's a lot of ways that we're going to get past that. But let's just say I'm sort of drawing a curve. So that's what I'm doing. I'm click, hold, drag. That pulls out two handles. Right? Now it's going to create what's called a Bezier curve to my next point. Okay. So what I did there is I just clicked, and that basically closed the curve and created an angle, like a straight path. If I wanted to continue on with curves, I just click and drag again to put another handle, and then I can keep doing that. This is how the curvature tool works automatically. It doesn't create points. Or anchors. For angles, it only creates curvature paths. But the pen tool allows you to go there, and if I just click and don't hold, then I've got a straight line. And then if I want to start going back to curves, I just click and hold. So it depends on what you're trying to do. You're trying to do something really angular and straight, you're just gonna click. You're not gonna do any clicking and dragging, making your little shape. So there's lots of times that we're doing isometrics or whatever. That's, you know, a suitable way to use a pen tool. But other times we want to create like a natural kind of flowing kind of brush line, and we're doing some tracing work, which we'll certainly get into. You know, be using the curvature tool to kind of work with it. So what you're going to discover is that sometimes you're going to get these weird sort of things. You're like, oh, that's not quite right. So what you can do is you can close off the anchor, but then continue on with another curve, which allows you to create a new curve that isn't constrained by the previous curve. So that is something to get comfortable with. So it's just called closing your curve. And then this is closing a shape. So you can see up until now, I've been drawing a path. And then when I close my shape, that means that I've now defined for Illustrator a closed shape that it can apply a fill to. If I didn't close it, if I just go, oh, this is there, and then I'm going to get real close, but I'm not going to close it, just like this. Okay. Illustrator still lets me do that, but that's an open path. Okay. So when I fill that with a color, all it's going to do is it's just going to draw a direct straight line from the beginning and the ending path, from the two open ends of the path. And we generally want to avoid that in Illustrator. There's not a lot of reason that I ever come across to leave my paths open like that. But if I'm drawing along, you can see, because it's an open shape, it's given a straight line. And that's basically why we don't want to do that, because we typically want to fill our shapes consistently. So we don't want this arbitrary straight line going in there. So we always want to, basically we want to be drawing shapes and closing them so that, you know, the color fill is just applied there. So the pen tool is great for doing most of your custom shapes. Again, it totally depends on what you're doing. If you're doing something like a coloring book, comic book, graphic, or whatever, your pen tool's typically your friend. If you're doing logos or you're doing something really geometric, starting with primitives and stuff like that, those are really going to be useful. So sky's the limit. You can do all kinds of great fun things with them, but just getting comfortable with your selection tools, differences between kind of freeform pen shapes and working with your pre-built primitives, those are your kind of fundamental building blocks in Adobe Illustrator. The next few videos, we're going to talk about different ways of combining our paths together, different techniques that we're going to use to draw our shapes, and really kind of move from there into getting into more advanced kind of specific things that we're going to do. And yeah, we'll kind of go from there. But I definitely encourage you guys, if you're brand new to Illustrator, kind of gone through the color stuff, just really get comfortable with working with all your shapes, applying your colors, and you know, I have touched upon using the layer palette here, and we're going to get more into how that's more useful down the road. But just be aware that every time you create something, you're creating stuff on a layer structure like this.